come sit at the dinner table, or I'll give you jewelry and so forth. He says, I don't want any of those things. She says, well, what do you want? He says, what I want to do is come sit at the dinner table with you. I want to follow you up into your bedroom, and I want to sleep in your bed. And underestimating him, she says, oh, sure, whatever you want. So he goes in and brings up the ball, gives it to her, and she goes running off with him flopping after her. And then, of course, the story goes on from there. Campbell doesn't tell the rest of the story, which is one of the failings of this particular book, because he's breaking up all the stories into these little slots to illustrate the slot so you don't get the full story. And he says, if you want to get the full story, go look it up in Grimm. It's the first story in Grimm's fairy tales. But the rest of the story, just for fun anyway, I'll tell it anyway, is she goes back to Daddy, and they sit down for their dinner, and they're sitting there, and she's very happy now that she has her ball back, and they're eating their meal. And suddenly there's this rapping on the door, and the father, who's the king, says, who is that? She says, oh, it's this frog I met. And he says, did you make any promises? And she says, well, yes, actually I did. You better let him in. So they go and they let him in. The frog comes in and sits at the table, you know, and probably zapping knives and forks and so forth with his tongue, and just sort of spoils the whole meal. And the girl goes on up to bed, and the frog goes flopping after her up into her bedroom. And then she decides, in a fit of rage, to get rid of it, so she picks it up and hurls it against the wall, which normally would kill the frog, right? But in fairy tale, out springs this beautiful prince. And he says, oh, well, thank you. You have liberated me from the spell that has been put on me. And she's, of course, absolutely thrilled and enraptured by this wonderful man. And she comes down. Daddy's amazed to see them come down. Up went this frog, and now this prince comes down. And he runs off, and they're going to get married. Up pulls this carriage that is drawn by Iron Henry, his sort of attendant, and they get into the carriage, and they're sort of running along. And there are these, Iron Henry hears these, as he's pulling the horses along, he hears these sort of three loud bangs. And he looks in and he says, Prince, are you okay? And the prince says, oh, I'm just fine. Those were the three iron bands that have been enclosed around my heart now, which have been broken by the spell. And that's the end of the story. And what you have there is, of course, it's a good story to tell for children. It's the whole cycle of moving from childhood into maturity. The prince who is the frog is, of course, the poor soul who's been possessed by his mother. The frog, as we all know, is associated with, in many of these traditions, with the mother, because the curse had been put on him by a witch, and the wicked witch is the mother. And he's sort of moved from out of his mother fixation into the sphere of self-responsibility, and she's moved away from Daddy and has gone through her transformation. The ball of the soul has dropped into the well and come out, and now she's ready for marriage. So that's the call to adventure. Now Campbell tells the next phase of the cycle is the refusal of the call, and the story of Apollo and Daphne is exactly the opposite of that. He says this is an example of the refusal. Daphne is sort of, Apollo is erotically, as many of these gods often are, erotically fascinated with this human Daphne, and she doesn't want anything to do with him, so she goes running off, and she prays to her father, who is the river, to rescue her from him. And he says, okay, fine, and he transforms her into a tree, and she finds herself frozen as she's running, and then slowly turns into this giant tree, and Apollo runs up to it and stops, very disappointed. She has refused the call of the adventure, which in her case would have been giving birth probably to some magnificent god. And that is the state of the soul of one who refuses the adventure. If you get a call to adventure, and in daily life this can be any innocuous little thing. It can be a telegram to show up, you know, at the Astro Institute for a weekend or whatever. And if the adventure is refused, and refused consistently, gradually your soul turns into this sort of petrified state of stasis and immobility. And this is what happens to you as a result of the refusal of the call.
Can we go back to the frog for a minute?
Yeah, sure.
What is it with the frog? I mean, is this just a Northern European thing? And it seems that there's always a prince inside the frog.
No. In Europe, what you get in myth is, back to the archetype theory, you sort of have this archetype, and whatever animals are native to the region fill in for the archetype. Mm-hmm. For example, in some of the Polynesian stories, amazingly enough, I guess there are no snakes in some of these island worlds, but there are eels. So you find the eel playing the role of the snake. In Northern Europe, the frog is playing the role of the snake / dragon. He is the serpent of the abyss. In a wonderful Native American story that Campbell actually tells in here called Water Jar Boy, there's a virgin birth to, I think this woman is sort of creating these clay pots, and then some of it gets inside of her, and she gives birth to a water jar boy, a boy in the shape of a water jar. And everyone's very disappointed except the grandfather, who takes a liking to the water jar, and for some reason, and he sort of, the water jar grows up a little bit, and he says, well, I want to go out and hunt. The grandfather says, you can't hunt, you don't have any arms and legs. The water jar says, well, I'd really like to learn how to hunt. So he's sort of, all right, well, I'll take you out. So he takes him out to Horse Mesa Point or whatever, and the water jar's sort of rolling along off on his own, and he starts rolling down a hill, and the grandfather doesn't know what's happened to him, and he keeps rolling, and then he hits a rock and shatters and smashes, and out springs this beautiful young prince, the Native American prince. And the grandfather sort of sees him coming on the horizon, and he's lost his favorite water jar, and he says, have you seen my grandson?